for it.
Let's go for it. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking of them now. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have at any time, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're so glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy Shuggie Bain. And as a special bonus, we have 50 book plates signed by the author. In your order, put a note that you'd like one. And the first 50 who do will have a lovely signature. So tonight, we're so pleased to welcome Doug Stuart back to McNally Jackson. A lot has changed since he launched the hardcover of Shuggie Bain at our Seaport store a little more than a year ago. And rather than feeling nostalgic for in-person events or despair about the state of the world, why don't we just take a moment to appreciate that since then, Doug has become a National Book Award for Fiction finalist and the winner of the Booker Prize. We're so happy to have him here. And I'm delighted to introduce Cheryl Pearl Sucher. She is an award-winning novelist, journalist, and interviewer, as well as one of McNally Jackson's original gangsters. A recipient of a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in Fiction, her first novel, The Rescue of Memory, was published by Scribner, and she hopes that her second, Alive Among the Ruins, will be in print before her cousin Julia turns 90. She lives between New Jersey and New Zealand and is the curator for our Between Two Worlds author conversation series, where she's interviewed Min Jin Lee, Sigrid Nunez, Susan Choi, and Sally Rooney, among others. Welcome.
Thank you, Maris. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you. I'm so
happy. I wanted to begin by just saying that the reason that this is happening is my good friend Jan Carr, who comes to every single one of my conversations, heard your conversation online with the Hay Festival and said, oh my God, Douglas Stuart is amazing. You should get him for your conversation series. And I said, I don't know, he just won the Booker Prize. He already did an event in the store. And then lo and behold, you come into McNally Jackson and you ask me for the new translation of the Odyssey. And then one of my colleagues goes, that's Douglas Stuart. And I said, no, it's not, because we're all wearing masks and nobody knows who anybody is. And then you said, no, 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 it is me, it is me. And you smiled with your eyes. You know, you have to learn now how to read people's eyes instead of their entire faces. And you said, I'll do it. And you gave me the name of your wonderful publicist. And this is how it's happened. And another thing that I want people to know is I'm able to coordinate with my friend Louise Ward, who runs the independent bookshop Wardini Books, which just became the independent bookstore of the year in New Zealand. And as she's streaming this conversation to her readers and your fans. So you're literally between two worlds as we speak.
So wonderful. And actually, it's like coming home to be back at McNally, because as Maris said, this is where I had my first and actually only in-person event. So I'm so glad to be back.
Were you anxious for that? Was it your first public reading ever?
Yeah, it was for the book launch, and I was super anxious and feeling very green and very exposed, but it was at the beautiful Seaport location and it felt like home. It was such a great location.
That's wonderful. So I think we'll begin. Why don't you just synopsize Shuggie Bain for those of the people who have not read it yet, and then you'll read a little and then we'll just talk.
Sure.
Okay.
I always find the synopsis a little bit hard, but Shuggie Bain is at its heart a love story. It is a love story between a son and his mother. It is a portrait of the Bain family, who are a proud working class family in 1980s Glasgow, Scotland, while the city is going through an incredibly difficult time. Glasgow, Scotland was a very industrial city with its fortunes wrapped up in shipbuilding, steel and coal mining and railway car manufacturing. And during the Thatcher years, it went into steep decline and unemployment went to about 26%. So that's the backdrop for the family. But Agnes has married the wrong man. Agnes is a very brilliant, intelligent, witty woman, and she is married across sectarian lines and married a Protestant taxi driver who essentially is incredibly heartless. He uses an opportunity to move the family to a new home to abandon Agnes, and Agnes begins to spiral into addiction. She was already drinking quite heavily, but this sort of accelerates it. Then we see how her children sort of stay by her side in order to try and save their mother. And it's her youngest son, Shuggie, who stays by his mother's side the longest. But Shuggie is also feeling feelings of being othered. He is seen very quickly, even as a young boy, as being no right. He's too effeminate, he's too precocious, he's too fussy, and this is a hard man's world. And so it's a portrait of Agnes and Shuggie and how they love each other, how they hope, how they hold on and navigate the things that are thrown up to them. This is where we meet Agnes at the very beginning of the book. I have this reading. And Agnes is actually, they are living in the infamous Sighthill Towers in the heart of the city. They've since been torn down, but much of Glasgow was reorganized in the 50s and 60s, where the tenements were torn down and a lot of families were rehoused in public housing schemes, which at the time seemed super hopeful and super modern. But then, of course, they descend into projects. And so this is Agnes. She's having a card party with some of her friends. She's looking around the room and she's already she's chafing at the smallness of her life. The women cackled without breaking their concentration on the cards. It was sweaty and close in the front room. Agnes watched her mammy, little Lizzie, carefully studying her hand, flanked by the bulk of Nan Flanagan on one side and Reenie Sweeney on the other. The women sat thigh to thigh and tore at the last scraps of a fish supper. They were moving coins and folding cards with greasy fingers. Anne-Marie Easton, the youngest amongst them, was concentrating on rolling mean-looking cigarettes of loose tobacco on her skirt. The women spilt their housekeeping money on the low tea table and were pushing 5 and 10 pence bets back and forth. It bored Agnes. There was a time before baggy cardigans and skinny husbands that she had led them all up to the dancing. As girls, they had clung to one another like a string of pearls and sang at the top of their voices all the way down Sucky Hall Street. They'd been underage, but Agnes, sure of herself even at 15, knew she would get them in. The doorman always saw her gleaming at the back of the line and beckoned her forward, and she pulled the other girls behind her like a chain gang. They held on to the belt of her coat and muttered protest, but Agnes just smiled her best smile for the doorman, the smile she kept for men, the same smile she hid from her mother. She'd loved to show off her smile back then. She got her natural teeth from her daddy's side, and the Campbell teeth had always been weak. They were a reason for humility in an otherwise handsome face. Her own adult teeth had come in small and crooked, and even when they were new, they had never been white because of the smoking and her mammy's strong tea. At 15, she had begged Lizzie to let her have them all taken out. The discomfort of the false teeth were nothing when compared to the movie star smile she thought they must give her. Each new tooth was broad and even and as straight as Elizabeth Taylor's. Agnes sucked at her porcelain. Now here they were, every Friday night, these same women playing cards in her mammy's front room. There was not a single drop of makeup between them now. Nobody had much of a heart to sing anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I think I would like to talk about Agnes as a character, but one of the things that doesn't happen here, and there's so many of them that happen in your novel, What Happened in Scotland, people taking their entire teeth out to when they're teenagers.
Mm.
People I know in New Zealand have done that, and that is such an extraordinary thing. And teeth consistently play a very strong part in your entire novel. Everyone is always having problems with their teeth.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's so many things about the novel, these little details that are so evident of the lives that they're leading, like the 50 pence in the heaters.
Mhm.
and what Agnes is doing to try to stay above it.
Mhm.
You know, Agnes is such a strong character. I found the women in the book are brazen, outspoken, fearless,
Mhm.
subjugated by the men because of the economic conditions that they're put in.
Mhm.
But in some ways, they're the heart and the soul of this book.
Mm.
And they're also really funny.
Mhm.
I mean, no matter how drunk they get, no matter how bawdy they get. And that's one thing I wanted to really emphasize is that by nature of some of the way that the book has been promoted, it seems, oh my God, this is such a tragedy. And in so many ways it is. But I think that one of the things that really enlivens the book and enlivens the character is the amazing strength of their characters, of
Mhm.
their love for each other, of their humor, you
Mm.
know, and how they really try so hard to transcend their situation, but ultimately succumb to it because they can't anymore.
Yeah, thank you for noticing that. You're right. I think the humor in the book is something that's often overlooked, especially in the press. But it's part of the Glaswegian spirit, and part of what it was like to grow up with that sort of hardship is that when you don't have the comfort of money, you have to take life as it comes at you. And so sometimes in the saddest moments, there is the most irrepressible humor or funniness, and then also amidst violence there's tenderness, and that is sometimes what it means to be a human, to have all of those things really close together. But you know, Shuggie sits amongst some literary giants from the west coast of Scotland. There are some writers who have written about that post-industrial landscape. We think about James Kelman, Alistair Gray, Irvine Welsh even on the other coast, or Agnes Owens. But they usually center men at the heart of the narrative, and that makes sense because it was a working class man's world. But I grew up as the son of a single mother, and so I'd always known Glasgow as a woman's world, and I knew women to run it. And I also knew it at a pivotal time where families were coming apart because of unemployment and social shifts. And so women were coming into their own, and or maybe not at the same time. And so when I sat down to write Shuggie, I wanted to really focus on women and a queer boy at the heart of it, because that was almost the story that wasn't told from that part of the world in that way. But teeth are really funny. Agnes, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is has so much dignity, and she rejects the shame of poverty, but she does have this very thin veneer of pride. And as the book goes on, it sort of isolates her from people who might be her friends, because who does she think she is? She has these airs and graces, and they know she doesn't have it. But having your teeth replaced was a big thing. I was talking to actually someone from a different class, from a middle or upper class, through the booker, and she said that actually her mother's wedding gift from her mother was to have all of her teeth replaced, and that was just how it was. She wanted new teeth for her new wedding, and so it was just a cultural thing, and I wanted to capture that.
Yeah, it's something that's completely unheard of, you know,
Yeah.
and one of the things that is also different is like in America, it's so much about money.
Hmm.
You know, caste is and caste, but
Hmm.
in the UK, it's so much how you speak.
Mm.
And one of the things that defines Shuggie, other than the fact that we see him in the beginning, you know, carrying a doll as a
Mm.
boy, which must have been, you know, just the most horrible thing. But he was really identified with his mother, even though he had this incredible brother and an older sister
Mm.
who are really looking after him and looking after the mother. But he's really just grasping at the straws of his own identity, you
Mm.
know, through this whole femininity and the pride that Agnes shows. Like, you know, I wore makeup because in honor of Agnes, because Agnes would never go out without makeup. It would never go out without, you know, a pair of stockings. And you see that in Shuggie's love of her. You know, there are certain points in the book where he sees that she has, you know, she has snags in her stockings and he wants to cover her. And he
Yeah.
always and he sort of embodied her dignity. And in some ways, the desire to transcend one's circumstance
Yeah.
comes from that pride.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think sometimes when people think you're going to write about hardship or poverty, that it's very gritty or grimy. But I was raised on what Americans would call benefits. We call them just, government checks, or government benefits, we'd call it welfare. And we would never go over the front door, and my mother would never leave the house without being immaculately done up in her best clothes. I would be scrubbed neat as a pin. And, there was just a pride there, or there was a sort of transcending what might be happening at home. but not presenting that out to the world. And I wanted to capture that for Agnes. But there's a weird schism or a break in the book, because the Glaswegian accent is very glottal. It is the dialect is very real. And Agnes feels a shame in that. She feels a shame in her regional accent. And that is part of British imperialism. And so she almost pretends to speak like a newscaster or like someone who speaks very standard English. And of course, it's an affectation because that's not the world she's in. Everybody talks with a Glaswegian accent, but she infects her children with it as well, or she corrects them constantly. And that is another way that she sort of ends up being isolated in the community.
There are a few other extreme societal structures that are defining your family. One of them is the Protestant and the Catholic divide, which I didn't really realize was so intense in Glasgow. You know, my husband's family comes from Belfast, and I've spent a lot of time in Belfast. And one of the things that you say for a lot in the book is these are really nice people up to a point. And that was my feeling when I went to Belfast. It was sort of like they were really nice, but the minute you mention the troubles, or you start talking, you know, and the fact that I was Jewish was a good thing. Probably one of the few places in the world where being Jewish was an advantage. But there is this, you know, Agnes was married to a Catholic. Her mother's a religious Catholic. Her mother and father, she was the only child in the family. She was prized, she was loved. She was like a Barbie doll. She was like Shirley Temple. She was their light unto the world. She married this good Catholic man, and then she leaves him for this horrible Protestant hackney driver who already has God knows how many children. So in a way, that was her independence, her sense of self, but also her incredible stupidity to do that.
Yeah, or also her desire for a more exciting life. She found her Catholic husband and the Catholic routine dull because it's what she came from. And there is I'm both Catholic and Protestant. My family do have that rift that I describe in the book. And I think the Catholic members of my family find the Protestants a little bit more, through their selfishness perhaps, or less attention to the church, they find them more exciting, a little bit freer. And there is that, I mean, whether it's a thing or not, that's how the perception is. But it is funny that I didn't realize that until I left Glasgow that people didn't struggle with Catholics versus Protestants, because it is so pervasive. And some of it's very gentle. It's a low-level hum in the city. We definitely do not have the troubles that Belfast had, but we do have the second largest Orange March after Belfast, which is a big Protestant pride march for anyone that doesn't know it. And they march through Catholic neighborhoods, and it's antagonistic. But there's banter, or there's hate talk at the kitchen table. As a young man, I grew up and was encouraged to fight for the housing scheme I lived on, to fight the Catholics on the other housing scheme, even though I was Catholic and my mother was Catholic. So there's a territorial thing too. But I had to actually go back in writing the book. I knew what it tasted like. I knew what it felt like. I knew how people expressed it, but I didn't actually know the social causes of it, because we don't talk enough about Irish immigration or about the upset to labor unions when they came to the country and undercut the resident Protestant workers, and how that led to 100 years of animosity. And so there's a lot of backstory there as well that you just don't know growing up in it. You just know that that's wrong.
Yeah, my husband is a Macready with a little R, which means they're Scottish Protestants as opposed to Irish Protestants. So I've been very well schooled in this divide. I'll tell you a quick story. Is when I was courting my husband, he wound up in the hospital in Belfast, the city hospital, which is the tallest building. And it was the beginning of July. And I looked out the window and I saw these marchers without a band and kids running away. And it was the Orangemen marching.
Yeah.
And it was like, I couldn't understand it. And then I was schooled in the troubles by the nursing staff of Belfast Hospital. So these divides, you know, are like in some ways our racial divides in America, you know, in the more impoverished communities.
Yeah, absolutely. But then also at the same time, the people are identical. I mean,
That's
in terms
true.
of racial makeup and financial makeup, and also oftentimes intermarried with each other, and yet they still find it's a really, I think it's I don't know, it's a very sad thing that humans can find the minute ways to divide themselves, considering they're all going through the same things.
I was wondering, you use a lot of Gaelic patter and a lot of idioms. When you presented your manuscript, were you told to get rid of them, or were you encouraged to keep them?
Actually, I mean, you'll know the story of the novel now, that actually when it was sent out for submission, it was, my agent actually told me it was rejected 20 times, and she later confessed it was 32 times. She just stopped telling me. She didn't want to crush my spirits. And so Shuggie actually only had one offer as a novel in the United States, and that was with Grove Press. My editor is an incredibly brave man. I think people didn't know how to market a story about Scotland to Americans. And that's, infer from that what you will, but that was the consensus within publishing houses. But my editor at Grove, when we went through the editing of it, there was a couple of times I actually wanted to clean it up and make it just a wee bit more accessible. I wrote the book entirely in service to the characters, Cheryl. I didn't think about an end reader. I didn't have any in mind. And so I did exactly what I wanted. And when we reached the edit stage, I suggested just a couple of paragraphs that I could tidy up. And he said, absolutely do not. He said, and so he actually stopped me from making edits, which I thought was unusual.
Let's talk a little bit about your evolution as a writer.
Mm.
You've talked a lot about this in terms of your upbringing, and this is your first novel. It is a Bildungsroman, but it is also a novel, and it's based a lot on your experience growing up. But one of the things that I gathered from my research is that you didn't really read until you were 16, and because you were too busy taking care of your mother, who was an alcoholic and who passed when you were 16. So it seems like a very short narrative. It's like someone taking up ballet as an adult, you know, to become such an accomplished novelist and not to have start reading until you're basically in high school. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened? Did you have any desire to be an artist? You know, in the book, your older brother, Leek, is a artist, is a painter. He's always taking himself off to sketching. Did you take yourself off and start writing, or was that just a dream that happened later?
That was a dream that happened later. I mean, I'm a product of the British class system, and so grew up in a city that was disintegrating around me. My mother suffered from alcoholism from my first memory until she dies when I'm about 16. And I grew up in a house without books, which is not a judgment placed on that, because actually nobody around me had books in their house. It just wasn't what we did. You know, our fathers went out and did different things, and we weren't a community that revered books. And so it was, and besides, I think for a kid to read books, you need an awful lot of peace inside you, and you need a lot of peace in your environment. And I had neither of those things. I was also being bullied for being queer, which we'll probably talk about. But when my mother dies at 16, I find myself alone. I never knew my father. And so I find myself alone. And suddenly, you know, I could concentrate a little bit more.
Did you go into care, or did you live on your own?
I didn't. I was old enough to be able to get my own flat. So I've rented room in a shared flat. And, you know, I was the first kid in my family to finish high school. And because I'd seen how sort of decimated the city had been, all these great men that had put their faith in heavy industry, Cheryl, had nowhere to turn. Like, these are very honest things to do. You should be able to make a living building a ship or getting coal, and they couldn't do it. And so I didn't know what to do. None of my family could tell me, just stay in school, because they didn't know what that meant. And it's a big investment to ask a kid to continue with education when you could use money that week, right? You could use money right now. But I stayed in school, and when I'm about 16 now and trying to finish high school, get my general diploma or whatever. And my English teachers just start to be able to give me books. And they start me with Thomas Hardy. We go into John Donne, Daphne du Maurier, Tennessee. And I suddenly, I mean, for a kid that hadn't even been out of Glasgow and seen much of the world, books transported me. I won't give you all the cliches about what books do, but I think what books allowed me to do was realize there were other stories in the world. And I don't mean literary stories, I just mean lives being lived. And that gave me a curiosity, but it was too late for me to go into English and academia. Also, no one in my environment saw that as something a boy like me should do. And so I was funneled into textiles, actually. Textiles is a very proud Scottish manufacturing thing. We make cloth, we make it beautifully, tartan tweed knitwear. And that provided me a good life, but it brought me to New York ultimately, which I was grateful for. And in 2008, having been a reader all my life, I sit down to write Shuggie Bain, but I write it in secret. First of all, because I didn't want to say to any of my friends, because they'd be like, what? Like, who do you think you are to write a book?
What gave you the impulse to finally do that?
Actually, it was not a conscious thought. It was much more of an urge. It was a need. I had a burning need. I'd been writing little bits and short stories and and things. But in 2008, Shuggie comes over me in a need in it. And at first I wouldn't allow myself to believe it would be a book, Cheryl, because I was too intimidated by the end result. And so I just wrote what was in front of me. And I started in the middle on the scene where Leek and Shuggie are on the Sea of Slag. And then, you know, I don't have the support of a creative writing circle or an MFA. And so I'm working on it myself. And that was really it. I had to fit it around the practicalities of my life. I also I didn't want to let the characters go. So I work on it for 10 years and it's before you now.
Do you actually knit or do you design knitwear?
I do both, but I design. I no longer actually work in design. When Shuggie was published, I quit the day job as it was. But I used to run brands. I used to be the head of Jack Spade, Banana Republic, Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren. So I design menswear. I'm probably in your husband's closet right behind you.
No, you probably, my mother-in-law, who's like a world-class knitter, is probably much more fascinated by that.
I was at the Hay Festival and somebody heard that I knitted and it almost sort of disintegrated into a half conversation about knitting. And I was like, let's talk about the book.
But one of the things I think is interesting, I'm always interested in the shape of narrative. And I think, you know, since you design, do you think that working for years in fabric or textile design give you an idea of putting narrative together? Because the way that I conceive of writing narrative, I always feel it's like putting pieces of puzzles together. So I was wondering if you, like, you know, you have to go from thread to design to fabric, you know, did that give you somehow another way of looking at how to compose a novel or a narrative?
Yeah, it did. First of all, I had to rely primarily on my ability to tell stories through visuals, or to create sort of a world that people could immerse themselves in. And that stops you telling as much and it makes you want to show. So you actually have to present the scene to the reader. And I wanted to do that as well because I wanted, if you were going to sit in a room with Agnes, I wanted you in the room. You had to understand what the sofa felt like, how, you know, what the smell was, how musty the air was, as opposed to me perhaps synthesizing it for you and telling you as the writer. And so I lent on that skill, but also in terms of creating textiles or in terms of creating stories, everything has to interweave and come together and then come apart. And there's lots of metaphors there that are, you know, about warps and wefts, but it is true that as well in textile design, you have to pay attention to the minute parts, and it's the repetition of them that start to ladder up into something bigger. And you step back and you look at it and then you go back in on the sentence level or on the word level. And so I've always had the ability with that craft to focus on the tiny and then think of it in the bigger end result. And that helped as well when I was structuring the book, to be able to work on those two levels.
When you say that your only reader was your husband, for years and years.
Yeah.
So is your husband in the literary world?
He is not. He's a big reader and a big writer. He is a modern art curator. Smart man, but not a novelist.
So what gave you the courage? You said that after the first draft, which you wrote almost at a fever, you had 1,600 pages, manuscript pages?
900.
So,
900.
800?
900 single space, so about 1,600.
Pretty amazing. So is that what you showed to an agent?
No. And so I spent 10 years refining it. And obviously because I wrote it out of sequential order, I had to then make a through narrative out of it and tie it together. But part of what I wanted to show as well is because loving an alcoholic can feel so random and episodic and like a non sequitur. You can have 3 great weeks and then a really terrible day. That actually I then started to structure it as almost these little vignettes or cinematic moments or literary moments. But no, the book never actually changed from the first draft to the final. The final draft was about 500 pages. It was smaller. It just distilled, it just narrowed in, and I got rid of things that were not useful. And one of the best pieces of advice that my editor, Peter, gave me was, he just said, this book is great and I'll publish it as it is, when he got the manuscript for me. But he said, but if you can keep the lens on Shuggie and Agnes a little bit more, people will be able to connect with the heart of the book. And when he said that, he didn't have to suggest any edits. I could find them myself.
No, he's genius.
He's a genius. He's a smart guy.
Genius because he spotted the beauty and the talent of your book.
Yeah, and he also let me figure it out for myself. He didn't sort of tell me. He tried at the beginning to suggest edits, and as someone who comes from a creative field, I just rejected them because I didn't want someone to tell me what to do with my work. But then when he said what he was trying to do, I said, oh, I understand. And I found different places.
So he knew how to talk to you in a way that you could respond to his advice, not his criticism.
Yeah, he manipulated me, Cheryl. I
He
think
all in the best way, and
all in the best way.
forever grateful.
Yeah.
Before we open up the discussion, I just wanted to talk to you about the nature of masculinity. I mean, one of the things that really struck me, having gone to New Zealand and having to learn everything about rugby and also in order to understand Kiwi culture, is there's this constant need in the Shuggie character to be a normal boy, normal in quotes, which is to mean like to be like the boy. And so one of the Eugene, who's the boyfriend that comes into Agnes's life after a while, and is actually begins to seem like a good character, but then reveals himself otherwise, gives Shuggie what he thinks is the key to being a normal boy, which is a little book, a little red book filled with all the football scores, the history of football scores. And that Shuggie, in his desperation to be normal and accepted, sits and tries to memorize these scores. And that's so much of what men's world is like, the masculine, the hyper masculine world. And in the UK, it's cricket, it's football, it's rugby. And there's such beautiful empathy in the character that I felt for the character of Shuggie, trying so hard to be the right son, trying so hard to be a boy like the other boys, but still holding on to this beautiful creativity and intuition that he has.
Yeah, and in fact, Shuggie had no concept of himself being different. It was society that tells him he's different. It didn't come from a place of self-expression. They just said, why are you like that? And it mirrored almost what they do to Agnes. And that's why I wanted to do it. So they're clinging to each other. But there's misogyny in the book and there's homophobia in the book, but it stems from masculinity, both of them. Because actually the homophobia seems related to the misogyny because it's an attack on femininity or an attack on being an effeminate, as opposed to being wrapped in religious zealotry or this is wrong. No one ever gets religious with Shuggie. It's just about, oh, why you like that? And so Shuggie goes through all these things just to try to fit in. And he doesn't even know why he's doing it. He doesn't like to do it. I mean, memorizing historical football scores is probably the least useful thing anybody could ever do, unless you're around men and you're in a pub and you can be
That's
like, Manchester United won in 1969 and they won by, and so he goes through them like this meaningless rosary, even when he's doing other things, and he practices walking like a boy. And a part of that came from my own feelings of being othered as a kid, because I was always made to feel like the thing that was wrong with me was just broken and I could fix it. If I was different, it wasn't that I was broken forever. It was just like, stop being like that. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because it places all the hate within the person. And it places like a fear of just trying to change yourself, trying to be different. And if you try a little bit harder. And so Shuggie's trying hard on two fronts. He's trying hard to save Agnes. And he's also trying hard to be the boy that he thinks he needs to be. And actually, it's the end of Agnes. Shuggie Bain is really about the end of Agnes Bain and the start of Shuggie Bain. That's what the book is about. And it's really only towards the end of Agnes that Shuggie starts to become a person himself.
I was curious, and I won't reveal anything, but I felt like the last scene with Leanne was almost like a coda, like in a piano sonata, that is sort of like what might have happened, what would happen. And it's kind of really beautiful. And was that something that was always part of the manuscript, or was it something that was added afterwards?
No, that was more or less all of the manuscript. What actually hadn't happened is, I'll give too much away, but it was more or less in the manuscript. Leanne for me is like the ghost of Christmas future, like you say, a coda. And she is almost the path that Shuggie didn't go down, and she's a reminder of that. But I find sometimes when we write about addiction or struggle in literature, it's always a singular person in a singular room having a bad time, or a family. And I wanted to keep just zooming out, Cheryl, and showing that actually there was a community at crisis. Even though my mother died of addiction, there were mothers all around me that were also suffering in the same way. It was a very collective thing. It wasn't just my house. And I think in middle-class communities, sometimes it's just that one house. But for me, it was a lot of it. And so Leanne is almost the ghost of Christmas, where this could be Shuggie and Agnes. and it is not. But also she's transformative for Shuggie, because that's the power of female friendship for a young
Mhm.
boy. He suddenly has someone who sees him and adores him, and he adores her back. And
And
so,
it's his first real friend.
yeah, all's not lost. Yeah, all's
Yeah,
not.
and one more thing, and the relationship with his siblings,
Hmm,
even though they're much older, it's very poignant to me. And also, like, through all the desperation, through all the struggles, the
hmm.
creativity that's born out of their need to survive, and the
Yeah,
fact that they don't really leave him behind
yeah.
is really phenomenal. I love the relationship between Shuggie and Bain. I mean, Shuggie Bain. Shuggie, it was really extraordinary. And there
Yeah,
are different stages of how you transcend the limitations of the world that you were born into.
yeah. And actually, Leek is one of my favorite characters, Cheryl. I'm so glad you said that. I really wanted to show, I mean, Shuggie is about love, but it's also about fraternal love, Agnes's search for love, Agnes's loss of love, Shuggie trying to love himself. It's about love in all of its sort of layers, I suppose, or all of its faces. And Shuggie and Leek for me were a really important part. Leek is almost a contrast to all the men. Here's a heterosexual man in a landscape that's all about hard, heavy men that like to drink and womanize and work hard and fight hard. And Leek's a very sensitive character. He's soulful, he's thoughtful, and he makes the biggest sacrifice in the book, and he doesn't tell anyone about it. He for
Mhm.
me was he's my Jude Folly, you know. He wants for a better future for himself, and society won't allow him to have it in a way, or his family won't. And I love
But,
Leek.
but unlike the other characters, he doesn't resent the other characters for it.
No, but there is a contrast I wanted to show with Leek. Leek's angrier with Agnes than Shuggie is. Agnes is Shuggie has no concept, as children never do, that things could be different or better, or you just love what's in front of you, and whatever you have at home is your universe, and you take it and you work on it. It's only when you become an adult or you get more something to contrast it with that you're like, oh, it shouldn't have been like that, or why was it like that, until someone tells you. And so Shuggie just loves Agnes in all of her flaws, whereas Leek is angry because he understands his mother's lost potential and also the burden that she's creating.
It's an incredible book, an amazing book. And I love that she looked like Elizabeth Taylor. My mother, who was very ill, they also used to say that she looked like Elizabeth Taylor.
Ah.
And she's just such a strong character, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful, uplifting book. And I have one more question, even though I lied before. You were asked this, and probably been asked this a lot, how did you transcend this chaotic childhood to come to where you are today? That's a big question.
It is a big question, and I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer for it. I think two things happened. I think I was left with nothing at a very young age. I think when my mother died, I didn't have anything. I didn't have a family home. I didn't have anywhere to live. And so at 16, it's forward or it's nowhere. And the minute I sort of kicked my life into forward gear, didn't I did textiles, didn't really want to, but by God, did I plow through, and then did I get a master's, and then did I end up there? And it made me exhausted by the time I was 35 because I was just relentlessly trying to get by, Cheryl. I wouldn't say I had any master plan, and completely disconnected from my emotional well-being for most of my life, because you just have to keep going. Even at university, I worked 5 nights a week, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, because I just had to pay for my lodgings and for my own food. And if I was sick, I couldn't go home. There was nowhere to go home to. So you just keep going. And I think that was it. I think if my mother had survived and still been in Glasgow, I would still be there, and I would still
Mhm.
be in her universe. And so it was really the house burning to the ground left me nowhere to turn.
I also think that you've said that when you were writing the first draft, you just relentlessly went through it. And I think that's one of the lessons you had from your upbringing.
Mhm.
I've been raised in privilege. Most of the people I know who are artists are really privileged. I don't want to write today. I'm tired. I mean, my hair doesn't look good, and all these excuses. My mother called me up. She's yelling at me. You never had that. It's sort of like, I've got to do it or else nobody else is going to do it, and I've got to complete it, or if nobody else will do it. And there's something to be said about that sense of determination,
Yeah.
is getting things done.
that's my silver lining. I mean, I would like to be able to take a break with myself, but I've just never known it, Cheryl. And so sometimes that can be my flaw as well, because sometimes I should just stop and think. But I've always had that power to manifest, because I just know to get my head down and plow on.
Well, having won the Booker Prize, it should give you a little bit of a chance to rest, at least
Yeah.
being knitwear designer. Anyway, I'm going to open it up because we have about 15 minutes. I want to ask first Louise in New Zealand, because she's dying to ask questions, to ask some questions of you. She's up there with the red hair and the blue glasses.
Hi. Kia ora, Douglas, and thank you. It's an absolute honour to meet you. I just want to show everybody the New Zealand cover, because it's quite different.
Yeah, that's the UK cover.
Yeah, I thought it must be, but I absolutely love this cover. I think we have the best one.
Yeah, and this is the American cover.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the publishers look at markets and match the cover. But I know we've got little time, so Agnes, just wonderful character. But I'm just wondering about the paths that your characters go down, and how Agnes had everything. She was the adored child. She's bright, beautiful, aspirational. So how could it have been different for her? At what point does she go the way that she goes with the alcoholism, as opposed to what this beautiful woman could have been, because she's smart?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is a deliberate choice within the book, because when I went back and I was thinking, when I interviewed some family friends about their addiction and all of that, people couldn't quite ever say there was a moment. I think we think sometimes in literature that there's a cause and effect, or there's a pivotal pin moment. Something bad happens to you, and then in a week or two, you come into addiction. And sometimes it's a very slow creep. And also, especially in hard drinking communities or cultures, which Glasgow is one, the distance between what is a good time and a bad time can be very blended, and you can't quite tell. And so even with my own mother, nobody could ever tell me when my mother developed a drinking problem. But my mother had a 25-year drinking problem. But no one could say it was a Tuesday in October, it was after she did this, or it was after your grandfather, whatever it was. They couldn't say it. It just sort of creeped into it. And when I started the book at 32, I didn't have enough empathy inside myself as a man to understand that, because I was looking for like the combustible moment, the moment in when you write a book where something happens and then something stems from it. And at the end of the day, life isn't like that sometimes with addiction. It can just be a loss of hope, a need to escape, because she is a brilliant and a bright woman and a beautiful woman who had so much promise and love. I think she's looked around at the landscape and she's like, this is it. The things that she wants in her life are very realistic. She wants a front door of her own. She wants to be able to buy clothes for herself and her children without going into debt. She wants a rose garden. She wants a caravan by the sea. She wants a little bit of glamour, and she wants to be adored. And the world at the beginning of the book almost sees her as too much. She's like uncomfortable. And it's not that she's too much, it's the world's not enough. They're not going to reach up and give her that. And there's a fantastic Scottish writer called Deborah Orr, who would be a contemporary as a person with the fictional character of Agnes. And Deborah Orr is a working class woman. She wrote phenomenal books. She was married to Will Self, but she was a working class woman that went to university, into higher education. And when she went, she was given a statistic on her first day that said of all UK students in higher education, only 0.03% were from the labour classes, from working classes, less than a third of 1%. And when you slice that for women, it's got to be infinitesimal, it's got to be tiny. And so it just wasn't there for Agnes. She's told to sort of place her faith in marriage and in a house and in children and doing that, and it's not enough for her. And then also it collapses around her.
So is Shuggie then going to be the one, like Hugh, that takes those opportunities?
I don't know. I wanted to leave Shuggie as your concern, not mine. And so how I leave Shuggie at the end of the book, well, I think I wanted the reader to muse on sort of the quicksand of intergenerational poverty, on what addiction to a parent does to a kid. And so we leave Shuggie just about to begin his life. And I wanted the reader to think about that. I'm hopeful for him, but Shuggie's not me, and we don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I won't take up any more of the time. There are lots and lots of questions popping up. So
oh, I have time to answer them all. I don't have to rush away. So
Maris, come back. Maris is much better at
okay.
questions than I am.
This. Oh, tons since I last looked. Okay. Doug, can you talk about the warrior Agnes scene and writing that triumphant line, Agnes didn't miss?
Oh, that's the scene where she goes to reclaim Shuggie from her father, right? Sorry,
Yeah.
my mind's a bit scrambled. Yeah, I was thinking about her as I just wanted her finally to stand up to Shuggie. That scene comes to Shug. That scene comes at the end of. I use Shug and Eugene almost as a comment on how men sort of have so much control over women's life in the time, but they're almost symbols of knights on horses, even though they're both driving hackney carriages. And, you know, we think that Shug is the evil knight because he keeps trying to sort of destroy his wife or keep her in a trap so she keeps adoring him. And we think Eugene is the white knight that's going to charge in. And then up at that point, Shug then looks like he's just about to destroy her. And I won't spoil what really happens. But I needed Agnes to be triumphant in a moment and to really show her strength and to rise like a phoenix. You know, St. Agnes was a sort of theme throughout the book for me, which was the patron saint of young girls and women, who was dragged out of her bed and set fire to by men and all of these things because she wouldn't sleep with the men or she wouldn't give the men what she wanted. And that's why I named Agnes Agnes, but I wanted her to sort of step out of her flames for a moment and just be triumphant and throw that bin through the window.
That was a great scene.
Mm.
Perfect.
I grew up also in a time where women would fight in the streets and I loved it. It was like, I loved it.
That seemed like almost like the television sport. You know,
Yeah.
like that people almost pulling each other's hair out and calling each other names and accusing each other of sleeping with each other's husbands. And it's all out there, Douglas. You did it. You put it out there.
Joan Christ says, you treat all of your characters, no matter how flawed, with such empathy. Is there any character for whom you don't feel sympathy?
Oh, I'm not a big fan of Colleen. I think Colleen was all cruelty and no kindness, and even up until towards the end. And I was commenting on the stigma of addiction and the shame that sort of heaps upon people. And when people are suffering from addiction, they don't need other people to judge them in that way. And Colleen comes in a very moral way. She's threatened by Agnes. She sees through Agnes and she condemns her. And then she's horrified when her brother takes up with her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Colleen's worst nightmare. But I'm not a huge fan of Colleen.
Danielle asks, what was the most difficult part of the writing process for you, especially since this was so close to your experience and heart? Thank you, huge fan here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, two answers for that. The first one was actually stopping. I couldn't let go of the characters of the world. Part of it, I write from a sense of loss or a sense of grief. And it was hard for me to say goodbye to these characters, even though they're fictional. They come from feelings deep within myself. And then, you know, people ask me if the book made me cry. And at times it did make me cry, but it made me laugh a lot as well. And I would think, oh my God, it would make me think of things that people would do. And I think, that was crazy. Like, you know, an 83-year-old woman running down the road with a rake and sort of swinging it. You know, there was just all these moments from life that I was like, that's crazy. So it was, I guess, a bit of both of those things.
We were talking about this earlier, but Linda asks, I know the book has been translated into other languages. How did the Scottish slang, etc., translate into the other languages?
I don't know yet, but I actually, what I did today was I spent the day in the Netherlands all day today, believe it or not. And I heard that they've done a phenomenal job with the translation. I don't speak Dutch myself, but that there is a dialect in the Netherlands that has the same sort of Glaswegian glottal thing. And so they've done a really good job. Whereas I heard the Norwegian translation relies on standard English a bit too much, maybe. But I don't know. It'll be fascinating to see it in Japanese. I don't even know Chinese. I don't envy the translators.
Susan asks, can you talk about your aim for including the incident in the Hackney when Agnes leaves Shuggie alone on New Year's Eve? What should the reader take away from that encounter?
What the reader should take away from that is that when women and children are vulnerable, people take advantage of them.
Yeah.
And that is just that's just the truth.
Mhm.
And when I write about these characters, I have to not flinch, because
Mhm.
I'm not in service to the reader, I'm in service to the dignity of the character. And if you send a 8, 9-year-old boy across the city on Hogmanay, bad things might happen. And certainly if a woman is drunk the way Agnes was, bad things might happen. And I think men see that sometimes, and there can be predatory behavior. And so that was part of it. It's about vulnerability.
One of the things I think is extraordinary about the book, Douglas, is that you don't flinch from what happens to these characters, but there's nothing sensational about how you present it. Because a lot of times when I read contemporary narratives, I think that some things are just so sensational and they're put to shock. But given the nature of the circumstances that they're in and what happens to them, it all seems naturally to come out of their situation. And there are a lot of, shocking scenes in the book, but they're so to the heart and so emotional and so real that it really makes them very, very important and palatable.
Yeah. Also, something that I hoped that I'd achieved is there's supposed to be a compounding effect where these things happen, but then there's no retribution, because Agnes and Shuggie have nowhere to turn to. When Agnes is assaulted by her husband, rape within marriage, she has no one to complain to. I mean, if she'd said to her mother might just have told her that was the way it was, and she has this obligation to her husband, but there's nowhere for them to go. And when bad things happen to Agnes, who does she tell? She would have been blamed. When they happen to Shuggie, he has no one to tell because he's already been othered by the community. And so that vulnerability, I think, increases, and that's what accelerates also Agnes's drinking. You know, she can't necessarily express it, but when bad things happen, it sort of multiplies in that way. And so I didn't want to, you're right, I didn't want to make a big show of it, but it has to be there because you have to see it get worse and worse and worse.
Anne asks, has the English teacher who introduced you to great books read Shuggie?
Actually, I don't know, but I was reunited with them recently because of the Booker thing. It created this Twitter storm in the UK. That was really lovely. I mean, in a lot of ways, my high school teachers saved my life. And just when I didn't know what form my life would take, they thought it out and they helped me. So that was really an awesome moment.
Craig,
One thing while she waits, do you want to go on? You can ask and then I'll ask my question.
Craig says, as a proud Glaswegian, I can testify to the authenticity of this book. I read some of it over Christmas and was teleported back to my childhood. The people, atmosphere, smells. How were you able to capture that so vividly? It feels like it had been bottled up and this was a cathartic process to go back to the 80s and 90s and get this on paper.
Well, thank you. Nice to meet you, Craig. Yeah, I think distance brought a lot of clarity for me as a writer, writing from New York about Glasgow. It also brought an enormous amount of longing, or just a sort of a homesickness. And I've spent most of my life, you know, or not most of my life, I've spent half of my life not in Glasgow. And so nobody really ever understands me or where I came from when I meet people. You know, I don't know what they thought of me, but they certainly didn't understand the world that I came from and the people that I loved. And so there's a desire there as a writer to clarify things and to set it into record or on the page. And so that sort of longing helped me, I think.
One of the things I want to ask you, have you been back to Glasgow? And has it changed?
Yeah, so I go back to Glasgow. I haven't been back since, since anybody left the house, but I'm usually there 2 or 3 times a year, and my family still live on the streets that I write about. So my family is still in Glasgow. I still consider myself Glaswegian. Glasgow has absolutely changed, and so it's had a huge renaissance, and there's a resurgence. It's still the creative, vibrant, hard-drinking, funny, sometimes violent city that it is, but it has, I mean, its economic fortunes have become night and day. However, I always feel like I'm letting people down when I say that and I paint that sort of like tourist board picture. Throughout the UK, and this is not a conversation about Glasgow, this is even a conversation about the States. There are people being left behind still, and the gap is widening and the social fabric is weaker. And so I feel like I let Shuggie and Agnes down when I say everything's great, because actually there's still tons of people really struggling.
Absolutely. I think that, Maris, do you want to have another question? And then we can let Douglas rest from his day of interviews.
I think I'll do Louise the honor of asking the last question.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you. I was just wondering, looking forward, and you've been writing for such a long time now, if you started Shuggie in 2008. So how do you go when you are writing fiction that's not quite so close to home? Is that harder or easier or more challenging?
I find it easier on the emotional level. I find it harder to care about it sometimes because I want it to feel as vivid and as real as it can be. So actually, we're about to announce my second novel, and it will be published in spring of 2022. And I'm currently at work on my third novel, and I'm moving away from my center of lived life, I guess, progressing away from it as I go. And as I get there, I find my third, they've been like very different babies to bring into the world. Shuggie wouldn't let me go. I couldn't let it go. My second book told me exactly what it was going to be, and then it did it. And then this new book is sort of testing my patience a little bit, but it's easier to write. I went to the Outer Hebrides and spent 3 months living there because I wanted to write about a small crofting community, what it means to grow up queer in isolation and loneliness. You know, I grew up in a time before the internet, and I'm fascinated by how we find our tribes when we can't connect digitally. And so I'm enjoying writing that, but I want it to feel very real. I don't want it to feel like I'm writing about the other, and that's the challenge. To make sure that when someone reads it from the Isla Lewis, they're like, oh, that is what it is. The same feeling that Glaswegians should feel about Shuggie.
And tell us a little bit of what your second novel, which is about to be introduced, is about.
Yeah, it is actually a love story about two young men who are separated. It's set in 1990s Glasgow. They are separated by sectarian violence. They fall in love. And so it's a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet against sort of Protestants and Catholics. But one of the young men is sent up into the north of Scotland in order to make a man out of him. And that has disastrous consequences that echo through the whole community. And so I wanted to really look at masculinity, and I'm always fascinated by really tender souls in very hard places. I say that a lot, but it's really true. I like that sense of belonging. And also Leek in Shuggie Bain is quite a radical character because he's gentle. And you know, I think it takes courage to be gentle sometimes when the world won't allow it, or when the world might take advantage of it. And so my second book's a lot about that.
Well, look at the United States today. We could use a lot more gentle men's souls.
We really could. Yeah, we really could.
I think that's about it. I want to thank this tremendous amount of people for coming to listen to Douglas talk about his amazing book. If you haven't read Shuggie Bain, I really recommend it. It's one of the great things to do. We're in a pandemic still. There's a great time to read. Please buy the book from us. And I'll remind you, there's 50 autographed copies, autographed plates available. So please let us know if you order from us that you would like one. And I would really thank Douglas for being so generous and kind, and for writing this incredible book that really is inspiring during these very difficult times. And thank you, Maris.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. It was so great. Thank you.
Take care, Douglas.
Bye, Cheryl.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.